Thank you for joining us here for our second CEO Roundtable. Just a little aside, I'll go off script here, but last year we had a fabulous CEO Roundtable. Many participants, including Rosemary, partook, and one of our feedback from that when folks were leaving, they said the only issue with the CEO Roundtable was it needed to be longer. And so we took that to heart, we doubled up, and we have 2 power hours here for you. So thank you for participating, for joining us here today, and welcome. This focus is pinning down the cloud, the necessary infrastructure for tomorrow's cloud services. Cloud is a hot word, one that Rosemary will define for us. And so we're interested to hear what our stunning lineup of C-levels have to say about it. My name is Jamie Scotto-Kataya of JSA, Jamie Scotto and Associates, and we're your hosts for Telecom Exchange, and we're honored to have this distinguished panel in front of us. So let's get to it. Each company here represents an important piece of that telecom ecosystem that we all share. And as they break new ground with their latest builds and their cutting-edge services. So let's begin with Mr. Allied Fiber, Mr. Hunter Newby, CEO. He's our Layer 1 guru. And Allied is planning and building a nationwide dark fiber network system that will connect the subsea cables to cell towers, to data centers, to co-location huts, to enterprise buildings, all along its long-haul and short-haul dark fiber routes, literally building that physical infrastructure necessary for tomorrow's access.
Thank you.
Also, you're welcome. Also from a Layer 1 perspective, I'm honored to have Mr. Tim Kiser. He's the founder and owner of Colo Atl, located in the global telecom hub of Atlanta. Colo Atl provides carrier-neutral and SSAE 16 certified colo data center and interconnection services to both local and global service providers and enterprise. So welcome, Tim.
Thank you.
Also with us today, we're honored to have Mr. Neale of Inteliquent. The company, formerly known as TNet and Neutral Tandem, delivers voice, IP transit, Ethernet, and hosted services to more than 80 countries across 6 continents. Inteliquent is also one of the world's top-rated IP MPLS backbone networks, delivering seamless end-to-end Ethernet, and particularly on its EtherCloud service that I mentioned for this panel. Welcome, Ian. And we're excited to have Mr. Clint Heiden. He's the president of Sidera Networks. For nearly 20 years, Sidera has provided reliable, high-capacity, fiber-based infrastructure throughout the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, out to Chicago, as well as access to Toronto and London. Considered Sidera as offering high-speed on-ramps to the cloud.
Yep, thank you.
And additionally, we are joined by David Howson. He's the president of Zayo Bandwidth. You've no doubt heard of Zayo's recent string of acquisitions in the news, and notably its impending acquisition of AboveNet. The company provides bandwidth infrastructure solutions and co-location over its regional and metro markets now across the nation. Mm-hmm. So welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome, David. And now, to further introduce these key innovators and to moderate our Q&A session, it's my distinct honor to introduce Rosemary Cochran. She is the principal of the industry's leading analyst firm, Vertical Systems Group.
Thank you, Jamie. And welcome, everyone, to the panel today. And as Jamie said, it was really this week, a year ago, that we had the initial Telecom Exchange. So congratulations on second successful event. And one of the questions that we ended with was, what about cloud services? And how is that going to look over the next 12 to 24 months? And certainly, as we come here today, cloud is hot, as she says. Now, as far as defining it, truthfully, pinning down the cloud is interesting, but there is no definition. The term cloud, and we've talked about that with a number of people today. Cloud is kind of things that already exist, and it's a question of putting it together. It's really about the solutions. So I think the second part of that, about the necessary infrastructure, is really what we're going to focus on. And that is that the network is really underpinning all of the cloud delivery system. And when you think about what's going on with cloud services, you know, we've got just a lot of content, a lot of infrastructure, but the issue is really end-to-end communication. And from the network perspective, which is our kind of forte, is really the crux of it. Because if you can't connect, then you don't have really a network. So the idea about the solutions is really what we're going to talk about today. And these distinguished gentlemen are going to help us with that. So we will take questions along the way. I would like to just quickly define, because we did recognize that when you talk about cloud, there are so many definitions that it becomes, you know, a separate session just on definitions. But from the big model perspective, there's certainly public clouds, which are open to multiple users, really internet-based connectivity. The private clouds, which are dedicated to an organization. And then what's really happening, particularly for larger enterprises, is something that's more of a hybrid model, where you have both public and private. So with that being said, I think there's really kind of a perfect storm happening here, where we've got you know, kind of four different things. There's content, you know, storing, accessing, and transmitting. We've got devices. You know, if anybody in this room has less than 3 or 4 devices that they use to access things, I'd be surprised. So there's a proliferation of that. There's the ubiquity of, you know, wanting to connect from anywhere. It used to be you could be on a plane or a train or a car and you didn't talk to anybody, but that's obviously changed. And finally is the expectation that you're going to get, you know, connectivity immediately and to anywhere, and you really don't care where that content is. So we're, you know, interesting the discussion right before about latency and about performance, and as I say, we all strive for what I call Jack Bauer time. If you watch 24, you know, Jack would take the thing and all of a sudden download the entire Library of Congress, you know, immediately. You know, that's kind of where things are heading, at least in expectations. So certainly we've got a lot to talk about in terms of solutions. So really this cloud discussion is really about solutions. That's the bottom line. And how these solutions for cloud services can be profitable and useful. And the issues that we want to talk about, certainly connectivity, scalability, reliability, resiliency, and performance. So I think the opening, and we'll start because Hunter, I know, has a lot to say about this, is what is the kind of the major challenge, and what do you believe is some of the some of the important things that are necessary for this infrastructure that has to really accomplish all of those types of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and thanks for that introduction. I'm a stickler about definitions, so that's a good baseline for everybody in the room and all of us to stick by. And I just wanted to say thanks to Jamie and everybody for putting Telecom Exchange together again. Fabulous. I think the threshold issue really is everything that you just described. Fundamentally, it is awareness, and then it's awareness of the fact that it's complex, and it can't be oversimplified by just saying a word cloud, because it's just too convenient to gloss over the nuts and bolts and the hard stuff. Then it becomes a process of education, just learning what's behind what you just said, and then ultimately the sort of the final equation is, in order to build infrastructure, you have to have really 2 things: a plan. Plans help, and then at the physical layer, it really all comes down to land rights of way. So ownership of, for example, buildings, in a data center or a carrier hotel environment. And then ownership or control of through rights-of-way agreements for the rights-of-way. That's primarily where the fiber gets built. And there are a few different flavors of rights-of-way, country by country, state by state. But for the most part, there's rail, there's utility, and then there's federal. In some certain local areas, there's public water and things like that that you can also use, but there isn't like a national sewer system, at least not here. And so fundamentally, those are the biggest issues, and that's what we've learned from looking at the past, a century or more actually, if you go back to in the U.S. Western Union and how they got started and everything else, the telegraph. But even to this day, and even as recently as last week when President Obama signed an executive order to integrate multiple federal agencies into essentially one to streamline the application process for access to federal road rights-of-way. It's an initiative. It's very challenging to integrate the bureaucratic nightmare of any government, particularly ours. But it's the right intention, because I think what his statement was relative to why the executive order was signed was, we can't wait. And I find that to be a very curious statement. We can't wait, meaning he's implying that we're waiting for something, which means we don't have it, and we're waiting, which means we need it. And what he's referring to specifically was broadband infrastructure, which is really a euphemism for fiber. And we've reached the point where there needs to be a new investment in fiber at 100 cents on the dollar. And that requires rights-of-way, federal road rights-of-way. Similarly, Mayor Bloomberg had an announcement last week with 5 initiatives for City of New York. Connect NYC was one, and there's several. And fundamentally, what that all gets down to is the biggest challenge here in New York City is landlords. The city's the city, but the landlords own the buildings and they own the rights to get in and out of the buildings. Now, we in the carrier community have dealt with, the likes of 60 Hudson Street and other famous, wonderful places for a long time. They have been dealt with, but now it's the actual office buildings and how do you get fiber into them, and the carriers are basically being stopped at the door where it costs a lot of money to get in, and it's very difficult for even metro network operators to deal with every single building in Manhattan because there's so many of them, and it's a very costly and very time-consuming process. So the real crux of what Mayor Bloomberg is putting forward is to try and flatten out that whole process so that fiber can flow freely in through the streets, through ECS, Empire City Subway, in and out of the buildings. So those are really the baseline infrastructure level issues that need to be aware of, educated, learned about, and addressed before we can begin to put the infrastructure in place to grow what is commonly referred to now as the cloud.
The cloud. Okay. Thank you, Hunter. And so that kind of is a good segue, Tim, into the buildings, right? The data centers. So you can share with us what your perspective is.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie, for having me here, and thank you once, as Hunter said, Telecom Exchange is more than I thought it could be. It's a beautiful thing, so thank you. I'd like to just piggyback off what Hunter said. I think for the cloud, the biggest problem is the infrastructure, which is kind of outside of my world because I am kind of the building, a neutral co-location interconnect room where either the cloud provider or the cloud end user would be in my facility. And Hunter hit on some very strong points because sometimes you can start a great business in a building and the landlord don't know anything about what you're doing, and then he hears all these acronyms like cloud, and all they see is dollar signs, I like to think. And all of a sudden your landlord's your worst enemy. And then that is hard for, such as these gentlemen, the carriers to come into the room, and now with the bad economy, there's just a lot of money's not flowing. So I think the biggest challenge, just to come off what Hunter said, was to get the infrastructure in the ground, which the initiative by Obama on the executive order is going to help that, because if you all ever dealt with going through 2 jurisdictions, it's a permitting nightmare. The guys are kind of like, we'll get to you next month when your application comes up, and then 6 months later you hadn't heard anything. So that's going to help to get the fiber from point A to point B. And then we've got carriers to get into the building. That's a threshold. And then once you're in the data center, I feel like that's kind of the easiest part, because I've already have the infrastructure, and several companies like me have the infrastructure. We're ready for it. But I think the big challenge about cloud is actually getting it from point A to point B, from the cloud provider to the end user.
Okay. Thank you. And that probably ties right into to what you know, your solutions are.
It does. Again, thank you, Jamie, for the time and the invitation. You know, our sort of foray into the cloud is actually hosting, together with Cisco, their UC products into the cloud to enable their VAR channel to actually sell to end users. And I think, you know, Tim's kind of led right into the point that I want to make, which is the cloud is this kind of concept that everybody talks about, but the reality of it is that you've still got to do an end-to-end service delivery. So our challenge is actually, because we are providing an end-to-end service right to the premise, is actually stringing all of that together and addressing, you know, which is a little bit of a motherhood and apple pie kind of fundamental, but when you get down to the end users, the resistance to moving to the cloud comes around, is my service going to be available, and is it going to be secure? And to actually provide the assurance around those two metrics, you have to go and put the whole thing together from the prem right back to, in our case, the data centers where we have the policy environment associated with the UC service. And that is the combination of a whole lot of things. It's Hunter's challenge of kind of getting the basic fiber in the ground, but it's really taking it and putting it up at a service level. And there's a transport solution you have to provide. We have an EtherCloud product that Jamie talked about, which helps us with that. And oftentimes, the fact that you get a one-stop solution with transport connectivity to the prem all the way back to the cloud is actually a significant differentiator, allowing success. But it really is bringing it all together. You're taking, in the case of the UC world, you're taking something that was largely contained within a customer's prem. You could open the doors of the closet, you could see the lights flashing. You're distributing that across, you know, a geography or geographies, and then at the end of the day, for the cloud to be successful for those kind of products and services which are intrinsic to a business's success, you've got to string it together. So our challenge is actually meeting those availability criteria across all of those fabrics to connect from desktop to policy. And in addition to that, wrapping security like SASE 16, the Cloud Security Alliance type certifications that an organization needs to be able to provide the assurance around Cisco. That's a key part of the infrastructure. It's not hard infrastructure, it's soft infrastructure that a company's got to have in order to be successful to really transition service to the cloud. So more, our perspective is more of a private or semi-private cloud solution in terms of your definition. Clearly, the public cloud is a little different to that, but from the point of view of a private or semi-private cloud service, there's a lot of pieces that have to come together.
Right, and you'd say in that case, the security is a major consideration.
So security's key. I mean, you know, one of our propositions in selling UC in the cloud is that we provide increased availability. Now, you can do all kinds of things at the network layer to kind of make sure that you can live up to that promise. You can have diverse deployment policy. In our case, we've put it in 2 different data centers as well. You can take care of availability, but it actually costs money, which is interesting in itself, because when you put all that together, it starts to impact your true TCO comparison against prem versus cloud too. So there's some interesting challenges, and there's some interesting resistance as a consequence of those challenges to services really moving into the cloud, which are intrinsic to a business. So.
Great. Thank you, Ann. And that moves right into, I think, what Clint can share with us about data centers, about multiple data centers and other types of challenges.
You know, for us, the challenge with the cloud is that the cloud's not equal. So, you know, you've got to boil it down to your main business point of driving revenue. And if you don't have a differentiator, you can't just fall back on this is the cloud and we're going to be part of that cloud. The ecosystem will not treat you all fairly. you've got to find out, for instance, when we're selecting a data center that we're going to build to, it's to some of Hunter's points, there's a lot of thought that goes in, there's a lot of dollars, a lot of cost, and I've got to make sure that that pays off. And there are a lot of data centers to choose from. So, you know, as we build out our infrastructure, we have to be very confident that that infrastructure is going to pay a return to us, or, you know, we're dead in the water. So for me, it's, you know, the solutions that we have to get to are, do we feel like we add a differentiation point to the data center that we're connecting to? Do we bring it to the cloud in a way that allows those customers to use it different, that allows them to transition onto my services? And if we don't, what am I doing there? So for instance, we just did Ashburn as a data center area, and you know, the differentiator that we tried to bring to the table was diversity up the Northeast corridor, which wasn't there before. And you use that as, can you or can you not make money in that area? And I would argue that it would have been hard for us not having that differentiator to go give something new to Ashburn, which has been there for 10 years. And but we figured that out, and each of us has a piece of the puzzle that you have to figure out. And the people that kind of think outside the box and the companies that do, I think those are the ones that tend to figure out how to make this cloud work. And then obviously we've got to bring the latency so that it all works right and the application performance is there. And you know, essentially if I can add something to the table that makes two data centers on opposite sides of the country feel as if they're a virtual data center together combined as one, then I think I've accomplished what that company is looking for and what the end users are looking for. They can put their storage in a cheaper location, their backup, and their main servers in a higher price location like Manhattan. So that's kind of how we picture things at Sidera.
Thank you. And David, maybe that's a good segue for you to discuss the bandwidth issues.
Sure. Maybe I have a more controversial view. I think a lot of the basics are in place for the cloud. You know, to me, kind of boiling it down to basics, it's the IT, the CIO in the enterprise outsourcing what they used to do themselves a lot. A lot of those servers and applications, etc. You know, the easy decision was to take the applications and put them into a public cloud, connect it with IP services, and you know, it's not really security concerns or anything. But as the macro economy puts more and more pressures on everyone's IT budgets, especially the large enterprises, those decisions to push out more of their critical kind of applications, they need security, they need dedicated dark fiber to their data centers, to their cloud. They need wavelength services. They need Ethernet services. And so I think we're starting to see, you know, over the course of the last couple of years, the cloud's gone, or the connectivity to the cloud has gone less from kind of a buzz term to there's real life bandwidth and big bandwidth being connected. So I think the basics are there. I think the ability to look at and chat to that CIO and understand, you know, what challenges they're facing, you're really putting together a connectivity solution for them. You know, I don't think anyone's the same. You know, they have different locations and latency requirements, and you know, part hybrid, you know, part dedicated. So it's really that solutions approach and being able to really understand your customers' needs. But I think we think that the opportunities far outweigh the challenges here. The basics are there, the technology's there. You know, it's about solutions, and for us, growing bandwidth at 700 plus data centers.
Right. Well, I think that you know, I would agree. I mean, a lot of the outsourcing is driven by economics, but the solution, it kind of comes back full circle. What we talked about earlier is that cloud is really euphemism for solution, because the pieces are there. It's a question of how to make it work better and how to provide that opportunity. And And I think it's that integration that is really what the opportunity is. Today there was an announcement, the IEEE had an announcement about what they're calling the Cloud Capacity Initiative. I guess initiative is the key word. Everyone's got an initiative now. But the initiative, and it was kind of interesting in talking to Steve Diamond, who heads that up, he said kind of similar things. At the IEEE, a lot of the standards are there, but they're in different places. So if you try to figure out, well, where do I go to the IEEE to get something on cloud, it didn't exist. So they're putting it together in such a way that now you can go and find out about clouds from the standards perspective. And there is a standard, I had to write it down because it's brand new, P2302, cloud-to-cloud interoperability. So some of these initiatives are not necessarily new. It's the issue about integrating the solutions or looking at what those interfaces are. And so I think, as we've talked about having the colo space, having the fiber, having the services, it's how do you integrate that? So when we look at that, and David brought it up, the requirements are different for different types of providers. So one question I have is just kind of the different priorities. Enterprises have different priorities than some of the carrier customers or cloud companies. Anyone like to talk about kind of what those differences are, particularly for mobile, because mobile integration is a major driver as well, trying to get mobile devices to work with other types of applications. Anyone want to start on that?
Yeah, we don't. We have a large amount of business in the wireless space. The mobile operators themselves, more for Ethernet to the tower and backhaul services, less so in terms of supporting their cloud offerings. So I don't have a view really on the mobile side of that from a wireless provider standpoint. Maybe some of these guys do.
I would just say that it's all good.
It's all good.
There's crazy demand, and it is it's maxed out, whatever's out there in terms of physical layer infrastructure, and more needs to be built. So that's driving all of our businesses, and that's really great because the business case is there now versus 10 plus years ago when it was a lot of PowerPoint slides and a bunch of guys around here pumping a bunch of high yield into companies because one made sense, and that must mean that 13 must make sense. And that didn't then. But now we have iPhones and iPads and apps, and there's probably, 1,000 apps a day get invented. And integration with all that stuff that happens at the higher layers of the stack is very complex. And that's great, and I'm sure a lot of people are working on it. It's all getting sorted out. Down deep, lower in the stack, it's sort of safer. Things don't change much, and I totally agree that the big building blocks are there and they're understood. I was kind of curious, though, that you mentioned this this cloud IEEE standard. I can remember a time about 10 years ago when I was at my last company, Telex, and was discovering the fact that these carrier hotels existed, basically where all the fiber providers built into, but it was the Wild West.
Right.
There weren't any defined rooms, now called meet me rooms, in these buildings, and they needed to be created. And there needed to be a standard because it needed to be predictable for the network operators. I mean, the carriers themselves didn't have a standard. I don't think the IEEE nor the FCC in this country still know what a meet me room is. I don't think it's officially defined. There are no rules, there are no tariffs, there's no oversight. They were created by independent companies like Telex, like Equinix, like CRG West, now CoreSite. We were all self-governed. We did the right thing because it was the right thing to do. I guess if someone wrote a book about the commonality between the major operators of carrier-neutral interconnection facilities in the US and world, they would find that there is a lot of similarity. Probably 3/4 of each business function in the same way. Without any outside standards body having to write the standard then for the companies to come fill in behind. So that's a curious thing about the physical layer that's different than what's happening at the application layer with the cloud, probably because of the vast majority of folks that can so easily write code.
Right.
And then they need to sort out how those different apps all fit, and there's just so many more at the higher layers than there are at the physical layer. But anyway, that's good for our businesses because it's relatively simple, layer 1, layer 2, 3, max, right?
Pretty much
maybe you're doing
infrastructure
something
guys
higher than
around the
3.
table here. At the IEEE, hopefully there's no one from the IEEE in the room, but that's not going to fuel cloud growth and bandwidth growth. If anything, it'll slow it down. You know, flexible solutions, working with, you know, companies like the folks around the table here and the real kind of end users is what's going to drive that.
Yeah.
Right, and I would agree. I brought it up more for the concept that kind of everything exists. It's just that it's not in one place. Not that this is going to make a difference. There really is no standards are a suggestion usually. I mean, for most cases. I mean, I think the innovation comes in being able to create, and that's Ms. Hunter, as you just pointed out, the ability to build an app in days now. I mean, it's not years, it's days, and you know, kids doing it in dorm rooms or you know, it is so phenomenal and drives so much of what goes on. But clearly, they don't care about your infrastructure. They're just going to write it and then worry about how much bandwidth it takes and how, you know, whether they hit their data cap, you know, in 2 days. So those are kinds of the things that I think the market will sort out.
Well, I guess what I would say about that is, for all of us, fiber is fiber, but it isn't if it's not there. Right. So there's so many folks that talk. Like yesterday I was at Light Reading and they had this big presentation, and the guy that had AT&T Mobile got up and he was giving the whole spiel about Metro Ethernet, and starts at the premise, well there's fiber, and then Metro Ethernet, and then we have, you know, VO, LTE, and all this. It's like, whoa, stop. How many tower sites do you have that are actually fiber fed? Because US-wide, only 30% of the towers in the US are fiber fed. So you can't say all of your tower sites are fiber fed, or else you're admitting that you only cover 30% of the US, which obviously, you know, the nation's biggest, greatest, fastest, best, wonderful. No. So you have to take fiber out and say, well, somebody's got to fill that 70% because LTE works optimally over fiber, and that's really what those folks want. Obviously, Zayo does a bang-up job of building new infrastructure all the time for the support of that. They all want Metro Ethernet services. So like you said, the people, and it's our job to make sure that all the people out there that are building apps don't have to ask what's behind the curtain. Right. We just need to make it work. And there's a long way from where we are to, you know, the synaptic level that everyone wants it at. So we've got a lot of years of building and a lot of growth ahead of us. There's a lot of places that need to get built out here and abroad.
Right, and it all bubbles up to solutions, right, Ian?
Yep.
I mean, you've got the solutions there. So do you see any specific vertical markets that are driving some of the, you know, solution sales that you see?
No, I think it's generally across the board. I mean, I think at least from the perspective of where we're at with Cisco UC, we're just at that kind of turning point where there's a real acceptance of moving that to the cloud. There's got to be reasons for it. Some of the reasons are that you've got a much more distributed population, whether it be within a corporate entity or not, and it's a lot easier to serve that population if it is distributed through a cloud-based policy environment. So, and the complexity and integration of UC sort of services are actually better served with common policy in a cloud or common infrastructure. So I think it's some of what Hunter's talking about, not necessarily the iPhone apps in this case, but the applications that are specific to vertical, to customize those UC solutions. That's what's going to drive that transition. My honest opinion is it's going to be less about TCO. I know that's kind of where you were coming from, but as far as the UC world is concerned, I think it's less about TCO. It's more about distribution of access to that policy environment, and the integration of complexity within that environment is actually what's going to drive that transition. And we're starting to see that. It's taken a while, but there is real momentum behind it. We're very serious about you know, being at the right point at the right time and following that curve.
Okay. In terms of bandwidth and you know, you mentioned latency, Clint, about coast-to-coast latency. How important do you see that as being, you know, the kind of the backbone for the infrastructure and the types of cloud solutions that people expect to happen?
You know, it's interesting. So you were talking about mobility and what's changed in those users. So we've gone from providing T1s to that service sector to now putting 100 gig links up between MSCs. So, and that's all because, you know, my 4 children have iPads and iPhones, and I do, and my wife and everybody else. So and they all expect, nobody cares about the cloud and nobody thinks about it or the fiber until that app doesn't work, right? Or doesn't download fast, or why did the song take so long, or, you know, so without the access, without the network, I think a lot of people overlook what that means to the cloud. Without the network, the cloud doesn't work. I mean, it just fundamentally doesn't work. Trading doesn't work. The financial services, you know, we did a build to Chicago, and the only reason we won that revenue was because we were fastest. Second place got no revenue. So latency is absolutely critical, and then, you know, scale of bandwidth is critical for certain sectors like healthcare, but you know, certain things are not possible over 50 milliseconds of latency, and certain things are. So that's why it's so important to try to get the hop to Europe as fast as you can, because it allows for perhaps backup, or the hop across the country. If you can get that down to 50 milliseconds, you can do storage replication in real time, and so you can have things start to work in more and more interesting ways if A, the network is fast, and B, if it's resilient, right, and diverse. So it's important that Zayo's in a particular location, and it's important that I'm there going out, you know, the other side, because if we both go down, that provides a horrible, you know, experience to the customer, and you know, so I just see us going from, you know, the latency and all the increases that we're doing, or the decreases. It's amazing what it opens up, and what, you know, the expectations of the users become, and we're just going to see more and more and more of that.
And it enables applications, basically.
That's right, right.
It's really the enabler. Do you want to add anything to that,
Yeah, I
David?
think it also enables, you know, the kind of more geographic diversity. You know, the big cost in data centers is power, well, real estate, and, you know, the kind of the outsourcing to the cloud. Probably not fully, because there's still a lot of kind of server huggers out there that want to be close to their servers and their applications, to their data centers, even when they've outsourced it to the cloud. But, you know, areas like Wenatchee, Washington, you know, Cheyenne, Colorado Springs, area in the Carolinas where there's cheap power, there's incentives to build data centers there. So the connectivity from tier 1 markets, where a lot of the eyeballs are, and the users accessing your mobile devices or sat at a desk using those services, to those kind of cheaper operating centers, I think is a swing that we'll see over the next, you know, handful of years. It's already there, it's already starting, so that connectivity, that's going to drive more fiber builds out into those areas. So I think, you know, the cloud services has been very tier 1 focused over the course of the last 2-3 years, because that's where the major data centers have been. So we see that swing going on as well, and again, it just comes back to solutions. Any one application of the cloud is so different for a particular enterprise customer. How they do that, part internet access, part dedicated access, DR goes into it. So trying to look at it through your customer's lens, I think, is the key.
Right. I was going to maybe ask you, Tim, to talk a little bit about the data center piece, because you know, as David's saying, that's really kind of the issue. Building or having those data centers in places like Atlanta, like tier 1 cities.
Yes, ma'am. The data centers are there,
Yeah.
and most of the times they have the infrastructure. You know, we'll just say the cloud, part of that, big part of why people are going to the cloud, they're only utilizing 10%, and it's how can I make money on the other 90? Data centers are that way too. Nobody builds like 1,000 square feet and fills up 1,000. They say, well, I hope somebody else is going to come, I'll build some more. They always have a glut. I know for me, I have probably 30 to 40% of additional infrastructure and space ready to take on the new services. And what I think about cloud, I think we all can agree upon, is the technology of the cloud and the apps and everything that's going to happen. It's just going to be a large demand. And then I think we come back to the crux of the issue, which is supply, which is all my colleagues here do that. There's going to be a high demand, but there's not a lot of supply. So I'm real happy on these initiatives, we'll cliche that word, is we got the facilities and the structures to have the capability to do all these apps, but we need the bandwidth, we need the fiber, we need all of it to be able to come in. And I'd like to go off what David said. Also, a lot of folks don't understand on the cloud, if you push all these services to one data center, we'll say such as mine, everybody wants a backup. So now we just doubled what we need by putting it on another offsite, and we got to, we'll say, backhaul it or get it over to there.
Right.
So I feel very fortunate, and I love, you know, like I said, the cloud could be a diversified term that people will call it, but for us, the infrastructure is not going to change in the data centers. I mean, basically, and I like what David said, those people that love to hug the box, we love those people in my world. So
Yeah.
we love to have them come in and hug box all day long in my room. And whether it's the hugger being the user, or it could be the huggio, I guess I'll call it, the cloud provider, you know, the data centers support both. So I really think the infrastructure is great. I just see the demand really going up because the cloud's an exciting, new, innovative. And, you know, now we've got the IEEE talking about, which, you know, I'm an electrical engineer. I hadn't heard IEEE in 10 years. You know, I thought they went away. So, so they've raised their head again, and to no avail, actually. And I agree with David. I hope nobody's in here with the IEEE. They might, you know, I lost my charter membership. But no, I think all the data centers similar to mine, which all we are is really is an interconnect, and in my room I'm neutral, so I offer no services. And there's quite a few, you know, companies like mine that are ready for the cloud, they're ready for people, and they're ready for this infrastructure to come.
That's an interesting point, actually. A lot of the data center operators are turning into cloud providers, right? Looking for other revenue streams.
Right.
You know, they've got their customer base in there. They've sold space, power, interconnects, and, you know, now moving into cloud services, cloud providing. That's interesting how that will work out just for some of those companies, and whether the end user wants to buy a total, you know, end package solution with all of those pieces together. I'm not so sure everyone will.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I wanted to bring up a point about something that Tim had just mentioned. Relative to fiber infrastructure building, and then folks that, you know, lease or IRU dark and light it, and but about the cloud, and it's really the distributed cloud. And I talk a lot about distributed cloud. Some people talk about distributed cloud computing. They'll add the word computing. It's a little bit different. What happens is a function within the server of CPU processing, servers connected via a network, and then the whole thing combined is the cloud. But what's really happening, and if you look at mobility and you look at LTE, and people talk about spectrum and spectral efficiency, and the constraints that mobile networks are now having because of all these apps and workforce and enterprise and everything else, what has to happen is that the server clusters need to be distributed physically, because you can't have them just centrally located in major cities, because then it creates this issue where sessions need to be established across great distances. And the network then is strained tremendously, particularly with video. So when you introduce video and you're trying to establish sessions from a mobile device to a source of content, let's just call it YouTube or Hulu or whatever, the greater the distance that has to travel, the more capacity it takes up, the more sessions, and then it overloads the network. So distributed cloud computing, and you could think of it as sort of micro cells in the way that they're trying to talk about small cells for cell sites. It's basically a container or a modular data center business that houses servers that gets physically distributed in different places. These are smaller sites They aren't the monstrosity million square footers. They are in search of cheap power. They need dark fiber to plug into. So we fashion ourselves as a sort of giant Lego pad, and you can take this little thing and just plug it in where you need to, which is great. And enterprises have needs, and hospitals, and HIPAA compliance, and SOX compliance, and video for mobile, and they can all be scattered about. But what's interesting is that none of that is actually going to detract from what Tim does in the major markets. As a matter of fact, Tim's boat will rise with the rise of the distributed cloud tide as well, because those are all points that are being completely unserved presently. They're all being stressed by network that essentially doesn't exist, whether it's in the spectrum, which all the mobile operators will say we need more. That's because they don't want to address the fact that there isn't fiber enough so at all the towers. If it were there, then you'd still have the issue of the long distance that everything would have to travel to establish the session. So it's sort of like peering. Peering is local. IP networks want to peer. They want to keep traffic local and basically offload as soon as they can. So there need to be more peering points. And these are not just physical and transport layer peering points. These are application layer peering points. And there will be many, many, many of them. But it doesn't detract from the sort of central nervous system, the core neural points like a New York or an Ashburn or Atlanta or Chicago, that all of those little local networks and local clusters will all feed into as well. So a lot of folks think of it sort of as one is opposed to the other, or detracts from the other, or takes away from the other, and that's not the case at all.
No, actually, more so, I think,
Yep.
because as you want to get that content closer and closer to the user, and be more distributed, and you know, we've seen that over time, particularly with back in the day with the Metro Ethernet forum, and you know, talking about Ethernet as a wide area solution, and you know, most of the engineers were working on local area networks, and there was no recurring cost for bandwidth. And then once you start doing recurring cost, it opens up a lot of issues, and latency and other types of things in terms of capacity, because you didn't have that same type. So I'm just curious, anybody here an IEEE member? Not anymore.
Just canceled your subscription.
You canceled the subscription. Interesting. You never know what's going to get hot button. But so, any questions from the audience that you have? Yes, Carol.
One of the things that I cover, I write about cloud and I plan events for cloud service providers, and the question that keeps coming up over and over again, and David has a leg up on this because I asked him this earlier, is how do you make services on demand the way how do you make network services on demand to match what cloud services need to be when, as Hunter has stressed, others have stressed, you have to put in the physical infrastructure. Then how do you manage to make money delivering services that the user can turn up and turn down at will, depending on what their need is, which that's what they want to do with cloud services.
I can answer that. We were talking about it earlier. You know, the cloud providers are starting to, well, for certain cloud uses, kind of use it as an offload. So if you've got, 2 days worth of very heavy compute, or you've got some localized storage to use, you're selling, AWS is selling cloud by the hour or cloud by the day. And so how do you provide, the security of kind of basic transport services, but the flexibility of IP to be able to just burst. And so Ethernet, we think, is the way to do that, and having a kind of on-demand Ethernet offering. As saying to Rosemary, the challenge there isn't the technology, the challenge isn't how to provision it quickly or those things, it's how to charge for it, and make sure that you're making money through that. The traditional telecom approach of selling for a fixed term from a point-to-point or point-to-multi-point, the factors, and you can do your payback analysis real well. You got to take a bit more of a leap of faith and say, you know what, we think we're going to get this level of demand, and it's this amount of usage, and here's how we'll charge for it, etc. So that's one of the things we're going through right now as Zayo, is just how we kind of productize that and put that out there, more of a charging model than a technology model.
Yeah, and for us, you know, that's what we look at as the future of what we're doing with infrastructure. I mean, I think it's all about the portal that you offer the customer. It's about instant provisioning. It's about monitoring of SLAs. It's about knowing what network piece is hot, which one has, you know, it's about taking a bucket of 10 gig and allowing the user to provision that 10 gig anywhere on the network at any point for any reason, up and down, move it around. You know, Chicago customer has a big announcement. They want to put 5 of the gig coming out of the Chicago data center, and they can provision that, let it be broadcast out, then re-provision it. I would say that on the pricing, it tends to even itself out. So you're gonna tend to have some of those, you know, because bandwidth stats don't lie. And I've spent my career in burstable kind of networking environments, and they don't lie. And if you don't need 10 gig, you don't need it. If you don't need 1 gig, you don't need it. But they you know, if you do need a peak scenario, you have to buy around that peak. You know, a lot of customers really need a rich and full pipe most of the time, and then a lot of customers have these burstable needs. And I would say that if I'm in a data center providing infrastructure, it's not for one or the other, it's for both, and they tend to blend in and make sense as a business model. So we absolutely are taking our company, our product, and how we deliver services to this model. And you know, that's kind of our roadmap right now for how we deliver infrastructure.
Right. Okay. We have one.
Thank you all. Terrific presentations. You did a nice job characterizing the pipes, the distribution, all those aspects of cloud delivery. How would you characterize the underlying data centers? Is there a set of characteristics that you look for or required to provide the support that you need?
Ones with lots of tenants.
Yeah. There's core and then there's ancillary. There's carrier hotels and there's data centers, and they're all in the co-location family. Carrier hotels are sort of like the central nervous system of fiber and wavelengths and core transport. Not a good place for servers, typically expensive power, limits on space. Data centers sort of hover around carrier hotels. And again, these are just general terms. Network operators, layer 1, 2, and core 3, they want to be in the carrier hotel meet-me rooms, and big enterprise. Servers sit in data centers that are sort of purpose-built from an infrastructure perspective for high density power, high density cooling. That's, at a broad stroke, the world, according to real estate and the definitions of each. Sometimes people use one word, you know, people will call it a carrier hotel a data center, which it isn't. Then some people will refer to a data center as a carrier meet point. But when you've got a data center that's only got 3 or 4 networks in it, it's not the same as, you know, a major carrier hotel that has 500 in every submarine cable system in that particular vicinity. They function different. They have different pricing, different products, somewhat. And they do different things. And I think the baseline, it's power. It really comes down to power. If you look at a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon data center, they purpose build these things. They're humongous. And, you know, they're 20, 30, 40 megawatts for a tenant. That's massive, you know. Tim's got a couple of megs down there at 55, I'm sure. But he's got a multi-tenant environment, you know, 70, 80 networks that all reside in the same room that are heavy interconnect, heavy cross-connect. Whereas data centers typically, you know, folks get nailed up to a couple of different networks and then they're happy for a while.
A little different answer, you know, from my standpoint is I've got to make a decision on, am I going to build to that data center? Am I going to build a 375 Pearl and spend $1 million doing it, which is currently empty? And we take the time to evaluate their philosophy of delivering service. Do we believe in that? Do we think they'll be successful? What market are they in? Can they capture market? Do they have a differentiator? Where do I play in this? Am I first to the table? Am I one of the diverse laterals out? How does that fit into my low latency infrastructure in New York? Where else can I connect it? How big is it? And what else can I do with it to support other verticals that I go after? And in that particular case, the answer came up, yes, I made the investment. We built into it, you know, but they're gut calls. You know, you're making an investment with these guys. And if you're last in, you got to make the same investment choice. You know, do I really feel like I can go in and pull revenue away or share away from who is already there? And if I don't feel like I can, then, you know, I won't make that build. So we put a lot of thought into site by site.
Okay. All right. I know we have more time, Jamie, or we should wrap up probably.
Well, it is time for the after party, and since one of our sponsors, the after party.
Wow. Is it 3:30 already?
Is it open bar already?
Yeah, just to wrap. I know we don't want to stand in the way of the after party. Clearly,
No.
that wouldn't be prudent, right?
That's not right.
Okay, but right. So we solved all the problems. We've got. Everyone knows what clouds are, and it's a wonderful panel. Thank you all for your insight. It was great to share that, and clearly it shows that there's a lot of opportunity and a lot more to talk about with cloud. But I would say that you know, the bottom line is that we would agree that, you know, it really comes down to the infrastructure, and that without that network, without the resilient, scalable network piece, cloud just doesn't work. So I think that's basically the major takeaway from what these distinguished gentlemen had to say today. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy the after party.
Thank you.